Hey everyone, so I was asked a question recently what I thought about genetic testing. This is a really complex subject. I hated this class when I went through my master's. I'm going to try and make it as simple as I possibly can. I'm going to try and give you a really easy answer to understand of why I'm not a huge fan of genetic testing right now. However, I do think that it's going to be the future of personalized nutrition. So, epigenetics. Epigenetics is basically the study of how our environment interacts with our genes and how our genes interact with the environment, right? And so there's basically three types of epigenetics. There's inherited epigenetics. Inherited is basically if your mom has blonde hair and your dad has blonde hair, chances are you're going to have blonde hair, right? Because that's inherited from your parents. There's a direct interaction. A direct interaction is basically going to be your environment. That's going to be your food. That's going to be your exercise. It's going to be if you're sitting in a lot of traffic in California and you're breathing in exhaust fumes, that's what's going to impact your genes. An example of this would basically be a compound in broccoli called sulforaphane. And sulforaphane acts on your genes to basically help reduce your likelihood of developing cancer. And so what it does is it takes genes and it turns certain genes off and it turns certain genes on. And what that means is basically, just because you have a gene doesn't mean that it's in the on position or the off position. It doesn't mean that it's expressed or not expressed. And it's just like a light switch, right? So if you were blind and you went into a room and you felt and you said, oh, well, there's a light switch right here. Well, you're blind. You don't know if the lights are on or if the lights are off. So just because there's a light switch, it doesn't mean that the light switch is always going to be in the on position or it's always going to be in the off position. They can go back and forth. And a lot of your genes act that way. A lot of your genes can be turned on through something. They can be expressed through something. Like smoking, for instance, can turn on certain genes that make you more likely to develop lung cancer. And there are, that same gene that can be turned on to develop lung cancer can also be turned off to prevent lung cancer, right? And so that's the expressed or unexpressed. And then the last type of epigenetics is a variation in the gene, right? And so this is basically mutation. Okay, this is where the nerd in me is waiting for somebody to be born that can shoot laser beams out of their eye because they have this mutation in their eyeballs, right? So those are the three different types. All right, so when you get a genetic test done, they do a little spit swab, send it away to a lab. The lab says, okay, out of these 20,000 genes that the human body has, you have this particular set of genes, and you have these particular mutations in this set of genes, right? So for instance, I've done a 23andMe, I've done some other companies too, but so I send it away, 23andMe comes back and they say, hey, you have a 70% chance of having blonde hair. Okay, cool, I have blonde hair, right? Now, if it said I have a 70% chance of having blonde hair, but I had red hair, well, that just goes to show you that just because your genes tell you that you're going to have blonde hair, or just because your genes say you're going to be 6 feet tall because both your parents are 6 feet tall, doesn't mean that that's actually going to happen, right? There's a bunch of different arguments, but the thing that I recently read was that genes are responsible for about 70% of us. And the rest of the 30% is basically up to lifestyle and environment. Okay, so we do our genetic testing, we get our test back, and me, for instance, that says that I have a mutation in something called the MTHFR gene. Funny enough, that gene is the motherfucker gene by scientists. So what that gene does is that gene basically tells my body, one of the things it does, is it tells my body how to handle B vitamins, okay? And so if you have this mutation in this MTHFR gene, your body doesn't handle B vitamins very well. And that's a problem because B vitamins are, they're responsible for a number of different activities in your body. And they just so happen to also impact Alzheimer's, they impact how you metabolize carbohydrates, how you metabolize energy, etc., etc., right? Okay, so I get this test, comes back, it says I have this mutation in the MTHFR gene. So let's say that this is the MTHFR gene. And let's say that this gene is set up so it's working perfectly. And perfectly, I mean that we have everything in order, all the numbers are facing out, which means that the gene is assembled the way it's supposed to be assembled. It's built the way it's supposed to be built, which means that the function that it's telling the body to do, it's going to happen. Now, when you have a mutation in a gene, that might mean that the gene is a little bit screwed up like this. Okay? That could mean that the gene is missing a part, mutation, etc., etc. Okay? Now, just because you have that mutation, it doesn't mean that that gene is now totally screwed, right? Because the gene can be, you can have a gene with a mutation. Let's say, okay, all of these numbers, when you can see the number, that means that that gene is expressed. It means it's turned on. Okay. Now let's say you have a gene with a mutation, but I flip all these numbers around, and just because I have the gene with the mutation, all these numbers are now flipped around, that means that gene is in the off position. So just because I have that mutation in the MTHFR gene, it's in the off position. It's not expressed. Okay? Now on the flip side, I can have that mutation. Missing this thing. I have that mutation in this gene, and all the numbers are on, which means the gene is on, which means that I actually have those bad things that happen when you have a mutation in this specific gene, or any gene really. Mutations in genes are not good. But the genetic test does not tell me if a gene is in the on position or if it's in the off position. It only tells me that I have a light switch, right? So that's the problem that I have, is that just because you have a light switch, well, it doesn't mean that the lights are on. It doesn't mean that they're off. It just means that you have a light switch. So the fact that I have a mutation in the MTHFR gene doesn't mean that that mutation might be affecting me, because it really depends on, well, is that gene turned on or is that gene turned off? And that's something that unfortunately we can't test. Now we could say, hey, you have this mutation in the MTHFR gene, and it means that, among other things, you're going to have really low energy because you don't do a very good job of metabolizing B vitamins. And here I am with the symptom of low energy, and I say, you know what, that makes sense. Because I have low energy, I've had low energy my entire life, so what do I have to do? Okay, well then we start to go into some personalized nutrition, and we start to go into personalized lifestyle. And so we figure out, okay, well these are the different things that you have to do in order to take this gene and make it work for you as opposed to making it work against you. Right? But again, just because you have the gene does not mean that that gene is on or off. It just means that you have it. And there's no way to figure out if you have it or if you don't have it, because just by saying, well, geez, I have low energy, well, that makes sense because I have this variation, I have this mutation in the MTHFR gene, and that's going to mean that I don't metabolize B vitamins, blah, 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 etc., etc. Well, it could also be the fact that I'm missing a chemical in my gut that allows me to pull B vitamins out of the food. Or it means that maybe I don't eat a lot of B vitamin containing foods. Maybe I don't eat a lot of berries, or maybe I don't eat a lot of whatever, vegetables, fruits, vegetables, right? Which are primarily where you're going to get a lot of your B vitamins. Maybe I eat primarily processed foods. Well, then it doesn't matter if I have this genetic variation in the MTHFR, because my diet sucks and all I use processed foods. Okay? So that's my biggest beef with genetic testing, is just because you have something does not mean that that something is going to impact you, but it also means that it's not, it could be impacting you and you have no idea. I think that as testing gets better, it will be easier to identify if you potentially have this particular gene, if it's on the on position, it's affecting you, or if it's in the off position. And again, that on or off, if something's in the off position, it can impact you. If something's in the on position, it can impact you. If something is in the off position, it maybe doesn't impact you. And if something's in the on position, maybe it doesn't impact you, right? So there you go. There's a whole other layer of complication. So I'll tell you a real quick story. We were approached by a company that wanted to bring genetic testing to the gym. And so I met with the rep, and I was like, okay, cool. So how much does it cost, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, all right, that's cool. And I was like, well, hey, listen, we want to do a retest on people like 6 months later, because we want to be able to see if we get this initial test on January 1st and the test says, okay, this person has A, B, and C. And so this would be their personalized nutrition. They need to eat more cruciferous vegetables. They need to eat less red meat. They need to take in more berries, right? Whatever. So they do this for 6 months. 6 months later, we want to retest that same test because we want to see if, well, did all this stuff improve this person's initial test? And so I said, okay, so what do you do? Retest every 6 months? Or retest every year? He said, no, you don't retest. I was like, wait a minute, so we're going to do a test on somebody, and we're never going to do a retest on somebody. And he's like, you're right, because the lifestyle things that you make based off of this initial test might not actually do anything. And I was like, whoa. I can't sell this to our members. This doesn't really give us any information that we can do. It would be like taking a body fat percentage on somebody when the first day that they join the gym, and then being like, okay, you're never going to be able to change your body fat percentage, and so there's no reason for us to do this ever again. It just doesn't make sense, right? And so when the rep told me that, that was the big kind of nail in the coffin for me from the standpoint of epigenetic testing is really cool. I think the more you know about your body, the better. It's definitely going to shine some light on some things that you might be wondering about if you're working with a great health professional like the Vreeland Clinic. Dr. Corcoran deals with this stuff way more than I do. I think it's beneficial. But if you're looking at epigenetic testing as a way to turn you into the healthiest version of yourself, you're probably not really going to be that happy with the results. Because again, it doesn't tell you if the gene that you have is affecting you or if it's not affecting you. It doesn't tell you if it's in the on position or the off position. Okay, hopefully this made epigenetics somewhat easier to understand, and you guys got something from this video. Thanks for watching.